you recall, 1 Peter is really about three topics: salvation, submission, and suffering. We've talked about salvation pretty thoroughly. We're in the midst of submission. And in today's passage, you'll find that a little of the submission and suffering get interwoven, which is an interesting perspective. So, if you would turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, we're going to be reading from verse 18 to 25. So, it reads as this: Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only those who are good and considerate, but also those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because they're conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges rightly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. For by his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you return to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. That's 1 Peter chapter 2, 18 through 25 in the NIV translation. So, there are two things that stand out immediately. We're going to be talking about submission and suffering. In fact, submission in suffering. So, point number one, there are earthly suffering servants. Servants should submit to their masters. So, when we get to talking about it, there's some conversation about, is this servant slave? Is this, let's just cut to the quick. As far as we know, they're talking principally about domestic servants. So these are not people, as in the American mindset, they're out there in the fields laboring and being mistreated. These are more commonly people that are closer in the household. Means they have a lot more supervision. Means they have more opportunities to offend, and therefore a lot more opportunities for trouble. Slaves in the Roman Empire. Well, about a third of the Greek/Roman Empire were slaves, servants of one form or another. Some were captured soldiers, or people from lands that had been conquered. Some either sold themselves or their children into bondage to avoid poverty. Some were enslaved over indebtedness or criminal activity. Nonetheless, we're talking about household servants, whether enslaved or indentured, their conditions varied widely. So there were some places where they were well treated and fairly educated, and was not the terrible mindset that we so often describe. On the other hand, there were some who were treated quite harshly. The conditions were as miserable as you can imagine, and probably more so. The thing that really stands out is that as a slave/servant in this time period, you were property. You're not a person. As such, you're not equal to any other human. You're something less. In fact, you're considered a higher form of an inanimate object, the lowest being a tool. So there's a shovel. That's at the bottom of the heap. One jump up from that, well, there's a goat. You're a little better off because you can speak. So you are a vocal piece of livestock. You're a livestock nonetheless. You're not a human being with the same rights as those you work for. Now, as such, you didn't have much control over what went on. You were told what to do, how to do, when to do, how long to serve, how to serve. They weren't asking your opinion. They didn't come to you and say, tell me, would it be better for you if I didn't get up so early so you didn't have to get up and start cooking? Would that be easier on you? They didn't do that. They looked at you and they said, the food will be here at this time. I don't care if you had a bad night. I don't care if you were up all night. Food will be here at this time. You don't have any choice in the matter. You're not allowed to marry. So whatever relationships exist, any offspring produced from that, that's property of your homeowner, your master. So your children could be traded, sold, separated from you. You can be passed around like baseball cards. That's the circumstance in which a third of the empire existed. In that limbo between, gosh, I feel human, I just don't get treated like one. So Peter says, hey, by the way, some of you have it pretty good. You have good masters, they're kind of kind, and some of you are getting the short end of the stick. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. You're to submit to your master. If your master is harsh, you're to submit to him. If your master is kind, you're to submit to them. Obviously, Peter isn't saying, hey, we need to overthrow the entire slave system. That was not the point. The point was this, that your submission is not for your own glory, but for someone else's. In this case, God's glory. So, since a master was free to do whatever he chose with you, you're valuable property. I mean, not like a sack of trash that you want to throw out. Nonetheless, I don't look at you with the same compassion and say, I wonder how you feel. I wonder how this affects you and your family. I don't do that. I look at you and I say, I wonder what you'll do for me today. It was more of a problem when you had an unbelieving master and a believing slave, because the premise of Christianity is that you're all equal. So suddenly you're elevated to equality with this person who has rule over your life when the culture says you're not equal. A lot of conflict there, and therefore potential for abuse. In this scenario, Peter says, submit. Submit because God commanded it. Submit because of good conscience. It doesn't benefit you whatsoever to get a good beating for being a knucklehead. I lied, I stole, I was lazy, I didn't do a good job. There's no honor, there's no glory, there's no benefit in that. So if you get a good butt kicking, okay, you deserve it. However, for being righteous and honest and faithful, if that gets you crosswise of your master and you suffer for it, there God says, special glory for you. So, when you think of something like that, the real question is, how do we submit? The passage talks about reverence or fear of God. I'm doing it not because my master is a great guy. In fact, he's kind of a knucklehead. I'm not doing it because it's just nice to not get beat so often, or to be up at the crack of dawn, or to work so hard. I do it because I fear, I love, I reverence my God. And if he says I need to do this, I may not have the answer, but I'll do this. Now, obviously, there are some points where it becomes a problem. Hi, I'm the nasty master who says I want you to do things that are clearly contrary to what God wills, and I want you to be a willing participant in some vile mess. That's probably not what Peter had in mind. However, there are many cases where, while it may be distasteful for you to do, it's not necessarily against God's will for you to do. And he calls you to submit. So servants are found suffering while they're submitting. Remember, submission is what is core to our relationship with God. If we don't submit to him, if we don't submit to his word, if we don't submit to his ordinances, if we don't submit to his spirit, we have no relationship with him. Well, God didn't say, oh, by the way, you only have to submit when it's easy, because you've had 12 hours of sleep and a full meal, now you can submit. Nope. He said submit, even if you got 2 hours of sleep, even if your toe hurts, even if it's been a bad week for you. Therein we become fully dependent on God, because, let me tell you, from personal experience, I have a really hard time with this stiff neck of mine yielding, and I need to look to somebody else to give me the strength. So it's by your reverence, your love, your faith in God that it's possible, not easy, but possible for you to do this. Well, more importantly, we talk about you as a servant, you have to submit. Isn't it convenient that Peter reminds us of Jesus' own example? And it was not the I had the 12 hours of sleep and the full meal and I've been on vacation for a week, so this is easy. This is, oh, by the way, this is to death. So he reminds us by paraphrasing a little from Isaiah, some of the things that are going on. First of all, he says, there was no guile found in his mouth, no deceit, no lies, no dispute, no anger, and he was without sin. Without sin. None of us can realistically claim that. In fact, without sin in the last 15 minutes maybe would be pretty good for me. But here's a man, the God-man Jesus Christ, without sin, period. None. He's standing before his accusers. He's being mistreated. Did he fight back? Did he argue? No, he was silent, like the lamb before his shearers. There was no deceit, no guile in his mouth. I'm not going to argue you with this. You know, you're throwing all kinds of false accusations, all kinds of nonsense, all kinds of blasphemy, all kinds of misunderstanding, all kinds of hatred at me. And he was silent. He confronted sin, praised faith. He saved and sought the lost. He wasn't a big self-promoter, said, hey, by the way, the Jesus channel is on. Please watch. And while you're at it, we have Jesus donuts over here, t-shirts. Oh, by the way, over here, you can get a subscription to my latest book, How I Did It. That's not who he was. He was not a great self-promoter because that was not his mission. His mission was submission. So he was divinely appointed to this. He wasn't a victim of it. Didn't say, wow, God, you really came up with this idea, this. I'm not sure I see it this way. What did he say? Not thy will, my will, but thy will be done. And we weren't talking about toppings on his pizza. We were talking about his manner of death, which wasn't 69 years down the road, but a few hours away. He was a willing participant in this. He chose this path. He said, I will, not if I have to. I will submit. I will accept the plan that you, God, have laid out. Now, I don't think God was sitting there at his desk going, I wonder, maybe we should try this. Maybe we should try this. You know, he had it mapped out from the beginning. The number of lashes that he would bear across his back. The exact curses and mocking that would come out of the mouths of soldiers. The time of day. The great drops of sweat. Every detail. Every minute thing. Already planned well before. So this wasn't a God shooting from the hip thing, and by the way, Jesus, you just play your role. This was Jesus saying, God, this is why I came. I submit to you. Now that makes my eyes big because I've never been in a place where anybody was looking to take my life. But just trying to imagine, I'm going to say, here I am. Maybe in the movies, but in truth, that would be very difficult for me. And yet, that is exactly what Jesus did. Our example, the heavenly suffering servant, by word and deed, our example. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He didn't avenge himself. You realize earlier on, the Assyrian army was camped outside of Jerusalem with 185,000 soldiers just waiting to crush the Jews. And in that night, one angel Must have been a pretty wicked dude, but one angel slew 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Well, what did Jesus say? I could call 12 legions of angels. So let's do the math, because I like that kind of stuff. A Roman legion was roughly 6,000 men. So 12 times 6,000, that's 72,000 angels. And if they're capable of slaughtering 185,000 apiece, well, you do the math. If Jesus said, hey, come on, boys, there would have been nothing that could stand in his way. Nothing. He could have avenged everything. Hey, you hit me, you spit on me, you called me names, you're thinking bad thoughts, I'm going to open a can with you. He didn't do that. He could. He chose not to. He stayed focused on the Father, on the Father's will. And that's how he, and that's how we can endure. Now, nobody's calling for my death. I'm not facing stoning, crucifixion, any of those good things. Thank goodness. I think that would be a miserable way to go. But I'm still called to submit in every little thing that comes up. So, my wife and I get this nasty note from the school district that says blah, 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 instead of flying off the handle in a rage and going and, kicking trash cans around. Oops. True or not true, my response needs to be tempered, because I'm called to suffer. Now, that's a little suffering. But how about the junk that I just went through with my health? I had some ups and downs, and quite frankly, this reminded me a great deal of what he says. Oh, by the way, you're called to suffer. Just so stop whining and complaining. Get up and get going, because this is my will for you. And by the way, when you endure it patiently, that's to my glory. Wow. You mean something I could do could glorify God of the universe? Something as simple as saying, not my will, but thy will be done. And a time when it was a lot easier to say, hey, step aside, this is about me. I got rights, you can't be disrespecting me. Well, Jesus says otherwise. So he suffered in silence. His job then was reconciliation. Remember, we were enemies of God. We weren't just estranged. It wasn't just sitting across the table going, I kind of know you and I don't feel real good about you. No, it's, I hate you. I despise you. I want to tear your head off. We're enemies, and not just frenemies. We're vicious, mortal enemies by my sin. So Jesus reconciled me. He said, hey, I've got a way you can get this stuff straightened out, which you're not going to be successful doing yourself. So his death, burial, and resurrection was my ticket to reconciliation with the God that I offended by sin. The power of sin was broken, so I could actually live righteously, instead of being driven by, hey, that feels good, that sounds gross, that sounds like something that I'm going to do whatever I feel. I can say no. I have the power of the Spirit to say, as much as I'd like to do that because it sounds like fun, I know better and I won't. As much as this sounds great and I'm free to do, I have other people I have to worry about that I might cause them to stumble. I actually could think about somebody else besides myself, because he died for me. He reconciled me to God. What about death? Well, death is the end. Close the curtain, it's dark, there's nothing more. Well, maybe the death is the end of any possible relationship with God if you're an unbeliever. And you think about, what would be separation from God? Well, let's see. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. That food is provided. That relationships are there. That there's heat to keep me from freezing my tush off. There's a chance for me to grow older, at least another day or two. To be separated from all those possibilities and to be right there, savoring the consequence of your sin forever, as opposed to an entirely new life in a new relationship with the God that created me. In a place where somebody was watching out for me from before I was created and will watch out for me for all eternity. Somebody who's got my best interest in mind, as good as my family is about that, far better. Someone who knows me, says, you know what, you're weak in this area. I'm going to help you not stumble. And you've been keeping that little thing, tucked away, kind of quiet. I even know about that. Come on, I'm not going to shame you. In fact, I'd like to relieve that burden of you. I'd like to put my arm around you and embrace you and help you to feel like you belong. So I'm trading consequence of my sin forever with a loving relationship with a God who knows me and wants the best for me. Whew. Those are the things that Jesus provided without complaint, without murmuring, without revenge, because he submitted himself to the will of the Father. As such, then, he becomes our shepherd and our overseer. Okay, shepherd, overseer, okay, shepherd. Well, think about a shepherd and sheep. My job is to be responsible for you. I have to make sure you have a safe place to sleep. I have to make sure that you got some food. I have to chase off those nasty predators, those wolves and coyotes and other things. I need to know where you are all the time. I can't just kind of go, well, I'll check in with you next week and make sure you're around. So I'm loved and fed and healed and protected by the shepherd, the great shepherd. As the overseer then, one more layer of responsibility. Responsibility for my soul. What does God say? Here's Jesus, and I'm entrusting you to him. And he says, the Father puts you in my hand. Nobody can take you from my hand. More importantly, here's God. Nobody can take you from the Father's hand. So if Jesus wasn't strong man enough to hold my soul and protect me, God's big hand is right on top going, I'm there with you. We're together in this, and we're protecting you. He says, I will never leave you or forsake you. He's always going to be there. I've had a lot of promises made. I've made a lot of promises. I've got to admit, I probably haven't kept nearly as many as I should. And one of the hard ones is, hey, I'm always going to be there for you. Well, one day, I won't be here. So, God says, don't worry. Jesus is right here. He will always, always, always be there for you. This is what was accomplished. This is the example Jesus set for us. So when my master then says, hey, I think I'm going to thump on you because you've been a lazy sloth, you're not doing your work. In fact, the quality of your work is so bad that somebody else has to come back and do it for you. Well, I deserve a good beating. On the other hand, if I do my best, I treat people with respect, I honor my master, and I love my Lord, and I suffer for it, perhaps then a little praise is due. Not to me, but to God who enabled it. So, before we close, here are a couple of things that Scripture says. Philippians 1:29. For it's been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. It's been granted. It's allowed. It's not a foregone conclusion. It isn't something you deserve. It's a privilege we're going to give you to suffer for Christ. So, we should expect it. We should expect that. Finally, a couple of questions for you. Have you ever suffered unjustly for your faith? If so, how did you feel about it? Were you one of those like me that stiff-necked, whining and complaining, making a fuss and doing all I possibly can to avoid it? Or were you silent and endure, knowing that you were glorifying God by doing so? In the midst of those kinds of trials, where did you turn for strength? Oprah? Google? Uncle Harry? You know you have the resource here. God says, I will help you. I will protect you. I will strengthen you. I will deliver you. Take him at his word. Thanks.